So hello and welcome to everybody. I'm Linda Fox. I'm Senior Reporter at PhocusWire and your host for today's New Reality With. Very warm welcome. The series of one-to-one interviews with industry leaders is possible via partnership with Salesforce, and working with them, you can reopen travel with support from salesforceswork.com. Welcome, Kurt. Thanks so much for joining us. Kurt is CEO for CWT, and we are delighted to have him in our hot seat today, our virtual hot seat, that is.
Linda, thanks for the invite. It's great to be with everybody today.
So let's just go back to February, March time. The disease is spreading, and the concept of a pandemic being declared is looming. What were your first thoughts?
Very interesting time and inflection point for me and for the company. We had just come off 3 banner years of market share and revenue and earnings growth. In January, we actually had our global leadership meeting in Shanghai, where we launched our new platform for the Chinese market, to much aplomb. And we were feeling great about the prospects for 2020. As February unfolded, it became very clear that this was going to be a pandemic, was going to impact us globally. We began to see governments take actions to quarantine and shut down. Companies began to restrict travel. And you basically take your plans and throw them out the window at that point in time. And I'd say we had several different perspectives and points of view. Number one is we're here to serve our clients. And so there was a significant amount of work to repatriate the travelers or the employees of our clients, to do a massive amount of cancellation and rebooking like we had never done before. We effectively became a cancellation service for a couple of weeks. We had to do that against a backdrop where all of a sudden in 1 or 2 weeks' time, depending on the geography, we had to take our people out of their facilities and enable them to work from home. And in functions like product or finance, that's not that difficult. In the call center or contact center environment, where almost all of our employees outside of the United States worked in contact centers, that's very difficult because you have to enable the same technology solution for them from a dispersed basis that you had in your host facilities. Our technology team stepped up and literally we made that happen in less than 2 weeks globally, which was pretty amazing. The other piece is you look at this and say, in a world where there's so much uncertainty, and that became very clear back in February and March, we would need to reduce our operating spend. And for who knows how long. And so what we did is we focused on taking temporary actions at that point in time. But 70% of our cost around the world is people as our staff. And so we had to basically very quickly go into planning for how do you adjust the size of your staffing and your operation against a backdrop of literally shutdown, of a hiatus in the industry that we serve. And so there's the intellectual side of it, which is what do you do? How do you do that mechanically? It varies by country. And there's the emotional side of that, which is that we had spent so much time working on culture and engagement with our employees around the world and done such a great job in preceding years. Now we're going to tell people, oh, by the way, we don't need you for the next 6 months. And I have to tell you that that has been the most difficult thing I have faced in a leader throughout this, is knowing that we have impacted so many people. And these are people who made this business so successful. They're our greatest asset. So trying to balance being fair to the employees in that situation and protecting them as much as we can while doing what we must to make it through the pandemic as a company. So I guess you immediately go into just what do we need to do execution-wise, but then as you lay there in bed at night, it's all about the emotions of impacting people's lives, and that has been very difficult for me.
And we'll look at that again as we talk about recovery and what you've been doing there in terms of right-sizing the organization. I remember back in January, I spoke to Christine Gadbois from within CWT about actually having a plan for a pandemic. What was it like having a plan for a pandemic versus the reality of a pandemic?
So we had, you always go through as a business, you identify risk factors and you say what could potentially happen. And so pandemic was something we thought about. We thought about it more in the early 2000s SARS context, which is domestically or regionally isolated, something that would exist for a period of time. We never envisioned a full global shutdown that has now gone on for 7-8 months. And so number one is the severity of it is something that wasn't real to us back even in March. When we knew there's a pandemic, we didn't realize it would be this deep and this sustained. The second thing is that in a prior world, when you look at the art of the possible, you have natural constraints you build into your thinking. So for example, if we had said, can you take 8,000 travel counselors that are working in contact centers and enable them to work from home and do that in less than 2 weeks, we would have said that's impossible. That will take a couple of years. Our technology team got that done in less than 2 weeks. And so what I've seen is people rise and just with Herculean efforts accomplish things that we would never have envisioned before. So the reality is simply very different. The other thing that you miss, and I didn't understand, I'm a guy who has traveled for the last 15 years, 300,000 miles per year. I love getting out there with clients and with our people. And I love the sort of the professional intimacy you get with people and the engagement. And losing that and losing that cold turkey overnight, I think has been very difficult. So we've gotten accustomed to this, video type of engagement with people, but it is not the same. And what you lose are a lot of the nuances in the communication and the thinking that people have, which are really what guides conversations and decision-making so much. So I guess the biggest surprise to me is that you have to work so much harder to solicit opinions in order to get to the right decisions. And that's not something I understood or had gone through before.
Okay, interesting nuances to help you make decisions. So let's talk about the sort of here and now a little bit. You recently had your financing announcement, and I just wanted to know kind of what are your priorities there with investing that?
Yeah, number one, our first priority was and always is to meet our commitments to our clients and our commitments to our supplier partners predominantly. And so we're staffing the operation properly. Our SLAs are strong. The other piece is that despite the hiatus, despite revenue being so suppressed now for the majority of this calendar year, and despite an uncertain impact, it is vital that we continue to innovate and invest in key products and key capabilities. So at the top of our list always are, number one is a killer user experience that is multi-channel in nature. We've done a lot of investment around the travel counselor and that technology environment. Number two is really extending our value proposition to our clients. And those are things like roomit, personalization, our data capabilities. And so we've continued to invest, albeit in a more finite fashion, in those core value proposition elements that we had before.
I'll come back to that in a sec, but I just wanted to also ask you, because you did touch on it before, about kind of, where are you in terms of furloughs potentially or redundancies, and how do you actually go about balancing, the need to perhaps scale up at some point going forward versus the right size of the organization?
Yeah, Linda, that's one of the toughest things, because first of all, again, number one is with the uncertainty around the depth and the length of the pandemic. We certainly know the depth now. We hit the nadir back in the second quarter. We know that we need to make adjustments in the size of the organization, because while this is a healthy, robust, great industry for the long term, it's going to be a smaller industry, corporate travel, for a period of time. And we can't ignore that reality. Our approach has been basically to say, how do we protect the skill sets and the talent as much as we possibly can? And then how do we mitigate cash spend that is unnecessary at the same time? So what we did for most of the first 6 months of the pandemic was temporary in nature. We took advantage of furloughs or leave without pay. About over 80% of our people globally were impacted by either temporary or full-time furloughs. Unlike we were not able, for example, to benefit from the PPP program, which is a US program. That's for smaller companies than us. So we and our larger competitors, for example, were not able to benefit from that. So, and our employees largely understood that. What we were able to do in terms of furloughs and the rules around that have varied country by country around the world. We continue to have furloughs enacted in certain countries where they are allowed. It's very disparate in nature. In some cases, the governments are providing subsidy to the employees that are in that situation, and we're thankful for that. The benefit of that is obviously that those people remain part of the company, and we're able to bring them back. And in many cases, those are part-time, not full-time furloughs. The second major thing that we did, going back, I guess about 2 months ago now, is we went out with a voluntary solicitation program. So you mentioned how do you have a workforce that is able to flex up to the needs of the business? We hope that the slope of improvement in this industry begins to go up dramatically, and I expect that will be the case certainly once there is a widespread vaccine. But it's very difficult to do that when you don't have a, quote, flexible workforce. So in the voluntary program that we offered, number one was offering employees the ability to go from full-time to part-time status, and we offered certain benefits along with that. Number two is we offered people the right to take long-term leaves. And three is we offered selectively the ability for people to voluntarily leave the company with some financial benefit. We literally had nearly 3,000 people that took advantage of those voluntary programs. And the biggest part of that was the shift in the workforce, especially with our travel council population, to create more flexibility so that as you see volumes rise, the part-time, full-time mix is more optimized to meet that. And our employees really understand that and are participating in helping us get there. We have done one very small targeted reduction in force. That was actually the only involuntary reduction in force we've done has been focused on management. We actually have 2 less operating roles on the executive leadership team than we did at the start of the pandemic. And we've really flattened the leadership structure to make our decision-making more nimble and make sure that we, to the extent that there was any functional siloing happening in the organization, that we really try to mitigate or eliminate that as we go forward. We've tried to do this in a way where we're very transparent and honest with our employees and our people. I think they all understand intellectually what we've had to do to make it through this. And we're trying to be very smart in terms of making sure we have the right skill sets and the right talent to meet the needs of the business today, more importantly, 6 months or a year from now. And so I feel like we've, with no playbook to start, we've done a pretty good job of doing this, involving the employees, and making sure that we're right-sized and ready for the uncertain future that we all face.
I mean, you talk about, killer user experience and the importance of investing in the future, but actually, how hard is that with, I'm going to say no customers, much fewer customers?
It's interesting. What we have done is, I'll give you an example. So with our Roomit solution, which is, we believe, the leading hotel distribution solution in corporate travel, clients that use Roomit see on average a 7 percentage point improvement in hotel attachment. They see significant savings because of the pricing arbitrage that we bring to them. We've had stellar success with that offline and through my CWT, which is our captive digital asset, but extending Roomit's content and technical capabilities fully through third-party online booking tools has been a challenge for a couple of years. We've taken the time of the shutdown or the hiatus to aggressively go after better deploying that solution through, for example, Concur. And we've actually made great progress where the users will actually have a relatively uniform experience regardless of the channel that they're booking in. And so we were able to focus resources there that usually would be doing other things for the business. That said, we have had to be, simply because revenues are so significantly down and will be for some period of time, we have had to be more finite in what we choose to do versus what we choose to defer or cancel. And so, clarity of strategy and clarity of what really matters in the value proposition has guided that. We have gotten a lot of feedback from customers. So one of the things historically, just as an anecdote, that we had were pre-trip approval solutions. They were a bit bespoke and they were non-standardized as you go across the world. And I think we're not dissimilar to other TMCs in saying that. But in markets like the US or Western Europe, where pre-trip approval was not something that was used en masse for a long period of time, well, that's come back in vogue now for obvious reasons. So we need to have a return to travel database where we can tell people, here's the health impacts, here's all the government restrictions, here's quarantine. And then there's a way for procurement or the organization that manages travel to gain better control of the situation. And so we've moved more toward, for example, standardized pre-trip approval processes and capabilities, and we have made investments there. And so what you do is you listen, and that was not something that we were focused on to the same degree a year ago. So I'd say what we're trying to do is, one, make sure we address the commitments that we have to our customers, Two is, as we look at what is the winning formula going to be 12, 24, 36 months from now, that we are well positioned to capitalize when the market recovers. And so it's simply a matter of choosing, and that's what strategy is to me. It's not about who's right. It's about what hard decisions do you make about the allocation of capital, for example. And the team's been very responsive to that.
Just because you talked about sort of 12, 24 months down the road, they just got an audience question here saying, what's your kind of take on the time frame for recovery for corporate travel?
Well, I can talk about hope, or I can talk about predictions. My hope is that we have a vaccine very rapidly. There is at least some level of return to the workplace, and you begin to see a dramatic uptick in travel. If you went back 6 months ago and you looked at studies that were out from McKinsey or BCG, or you listened to the airlines, you would have thought that corporate travel would begin to see a pretty solid recovery this fall. While we're seeing Western Europe trade slightly better than the United States, you're really seeing the US lag, and you're seeing a flattening or a slowing of the recovery in many of the Western markets. And so it's becoming clear to me that you're not going to see a fundamental dramatic improvement in the slope of recovery, again, until there is a return to workplace, which is largely predicated on a vaccine. And so my belief is, what I'm hearing from the media is there will be a vaccine this winter, perhaps. It will take some time for that to be widespread. And there have been certain habits bred now through the pandemic, and probably certain budgeting that's going to keep travel more limited, certainly through 2021. But if I went out a year from now, I would tell you that we're on the slope toward normalcy. We do believe it's going to be a multi-year recovery. We're not going to see 2019 levels of traffic probably for a couple of years. And we're probably not going to see 2019 levels of transactions for a couple of years. We're probably not going to see 2019 levels of air traffic for 4 or 5 years. And the reason for that is you're going to see a recovery that's more domestic-led, and the long-haul international travel will lag that. And that long-haul international travel is what's most valuable from a traffic perspective. So this is anywhere from a 2, 3, 4, 5-year recovery. Again, it's going to be a smaller industry for a period of time. And I think you're going to see a significant amount of dislocation over the next 6 to 9 months. There are temporary programs that have been offered by governments to certain companies that are now running out. And so I think it's going to be a very challenging environment. But the winning formula remains what it was before, which is a consumer-grade user experience backed by all the business logic we need, and then having unique value propositions that really optimize the buying of our clients. And so those are things where scale and the ability to deploy technology globally are going to really matter, and matter perhaps tomorrow even more than they did back in 2019.
Here's another interesting question from the audience. People talking about bad outcomes of a pandemic, but do you see any good sides of a pandemic?
That's a tough one. There is a significant amount of pent-up demand by our clients to get back on the road, our clients and their travelers. And so perhaps that which we take for granted, which is the ability to engage with people and this sort of second family we have in business, I don't think people will take it for granted once we get through this. We'll realize how lucky we are to be able to sit in a conference room together, to be able to actually visit a client, engage with them, and tell your story. And those were things perhaps we took for granted yesterday. One of the big challenges for TMCs globally, and I've been with CWT now for 4.5 years, so I walked into the middle of this, was that from a client perspective, the services provided by a TMC to our corporate clients have over time become commoditized. And so by that I mean that the buyer, procurement, they narrow things down to the lowest common denominator in terms of price and a common set of services. And I think we perhaps in the industry were guilty of not sufficiently differentiating ourselves. And so that was a consequence of it. And you saw largely a move from subscription fee or management fee type pricing to, again, what I call commoditized transaction fees. And over time, that has moved ever downward. It's very typical in a mature B2B industry for competitors to compete away down to the lowest penny of margin. And that's been a phenomenon in our industry. One of the perhaps long-term positive changes here is that the commoditization trend in terms of buying hopefully has stopped. I think we and our competitors are able to articulate our value to the buyers, to our customers in a new and different way. I think they appreciate what we do for them much more, perhaps, than they did yesterday. We're not an online travel agent. We're very, very different. And so I think that a positive consequence may be that we go back to the future a bit, and that there is a shift in the commercial model between TMCs and our clients. And that is one that perhaps manages risk better than the transaction fee model had for us yesterday and today. So it's difficult. Now, I don't think that that's innovation by itself, by the way. That's an outcome of being able to articulate value proposition in a new and different way than we did yesterday. But I think we, and I'm guessing our competitors, will be up to that task tomorrow better than we were yesterday.
So what then do you think some of the models will be? Because I know some of the smaller agencies can look at subscription models type services, but I don't envisage that a larger one would do that unless it offered a hybrid. So I'm just wondering what your take on models might be.
So we have, there's not a one size fits all. So as you look at our larger customers, and we've got many, many larger customers, many of them are very specific about how you have to price in order to compete for their business. And so you don't have a choice. And again, they're effectively what's happening is they're commoditizing the buying because you're bidding at a price point, and it's more difficult to articulate value proposition through that.
Sure.
We do have still a minority, but a significant portion of our client revenue that is under a management fee or subscription model. The hybrid is more the approach that has lived, to where there's a team that may be dedicated to a specific account, or part of a team that's dedicated with overflow going to another place. And so that has lived, and I think that's going to become more attractive, because what the clients have articulated to us is, we want Jim and Sally to be servicing our account. We really like them. Well, if we're going to be in that world and have a bespoke approach, we have to price differently than we have traditionally. So I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. We've been for the last 6 months experimenting with a number of different models. We've gone in with, we've made permanent changes in some contracts, but we've made temporary changes in others where we've moved away from a strict transaction fee model. I don't think you're going to see one size fits all. You're still going to see, especially with large buyers, you're still going to see a significant portion of transaction fee pricing. And you'll see a hybrid, and you'll see certain that want a management fee. But I think that the generic move will be toward more of a hybrid model as you talk about it. It simply makes sense. Otherwise, what happens is when we go into a situation like this, and the TMC is very financially exposed, especially, for example, in many of the European markets where legally you can't right-size the organization without spending an inordinate amount of cash. So again, I think that is going to change. We're only as good as sort of our competitors, meaning that will hold as long as people are behaving rationally. And again, in a mature B2B market, you can't be assured that everyone will behave rationally. Somebody may come in with very aggressive commodity type pricing because they're looking at that specific account, or what's the margin opportunity if I pick off this one customer. And so what happens is that's very rational when you apply it to that customer. When you look at it in mass, you say, gosh, that has a negative effect on the yield we derive from clients. So I think those two forces will compete. One is the need to, I think, better align the risk between TMCs and customers. And two is this very hyper-competitive market in which we operate. And so the consequence is pricing will always be a challenge for us. We need to be smarter about how we articulate our value, we as an industry, to the client, to get out of the commodity spiral that we have been in for a long period of time.
Okay. Now, challenges, and there are many right now, as we all know. You had an extra one, and the cyber incident, and you're not the only company to say that they've been under increased attack. Booking.com group as well, Booking Group rather, said so as well. So, why is it, do you think, that this sort of challenge is companies are open to this sort of challenge right now?
Well, I think look, there are many bad actors around the world, and you've seen cybercrime become a growth industry in the pandemic. The numbers I hear cited are that tens of thousands of companies have been impacted over the last 6 to 9 months. What I'll simply say about CWT is that we certainly were not the first, and we're not going to be the last to be impacted by the sort of unwarranted hostility by bad actors. It's a very difficult circumstance to go through. I'm very proud of the way our technology team responded and the capabilities we had in place when it happened. But beyond what we've said publicly already, Linda, we're not going to comment any further.
Okay, no, fair enough. So if you're thinking about innovation in pricing models, you must also be thinking about innovation in product. And is now the time to do that? There are people at the moment saying there's so much friction in the process, in the booking. Can you address some of these issues now so that when we do get back to sort of recovery, it isn't such an onerous process?
The answer is yes. There is, we talk about, for example, with online booking transactions, you talk about touched versus untouched. Well, that inherently speaks to inefficiency in the process. So we have invested probably more in our travel counselor facing capabilities than any part of the business other than Roomit over the last 3 years. And so that's all about better UX, but better UX implies the ability to self-service that which is simple. And we're aggressively moving in that direction. And there are so many different touch points. If you look at a legacy TMC's infrastructure with a front office and mid office, et cetera, there's a lot of inefficiency born there. There's some reliance for air booking on GDSs. There's really no reliance on hotel booking for GDSs. And so what you have is this ecosystem we're managing where it's our technology as well as certain third-party technologies. And getting those to synchronize as best as possible is where there is a significant amount of opportunity. So that has been one of our big focuses, is making sure that the toolkit that our travel counselors have is as modern and as efficient as possible, and that for the user, there's little to no friction in the process. And for example, that the user experience in shopping through Concur versus calling us or using our new messaging capability is relatively ubiquitous. And so I think we've made very good strides there, but there's still a significant opportunity. One of the interesting questions, and I'm sure NDC will come up today, but is how I think about NDC versus that, which I think going to be an interesting, challenging part of the conversation.
Well, how do you? Because that question is here, and it's you've got Delta sort of backing away from it for the time being, and obviously Air France-KLM going hell for leather, so to speak. So what do you think that's going to be the effect on your kind of operations going forward?
So let me. There are two different ways to think about NDC. NDC in its purest form to me is the desire by carriers to sell dynamically in B2B the way they do in B2C. And that's a virtuous ambition. And they've invested a significant amount in their product and their fleet and their capabilities. And I think it's pro-user experience to be able to promulgate that through the B2B channel. And so we have last year we formed a discrete NDC team. We're working hard with technology partners and with the airlines to make this a reality. Delta, you mentioned, which is a great example. Delta is focused on storefront, which is they want to be able to impact the merchandising or the display of their product across channels. Mm-hmm. And so we're working hard to make that a reality. I see that as, again, pro-competitive, and as long as we do it properly, it's going to be productive for us as well. So we have made dramatic strides to basically get all of our counselors onto the GUI modern desktops of the GDS. We implemented a new CX platform, a customer experience platform, and so we're able to basically roll that out at scale with the assistance of technology partners. And so I'm very much into that. I think that's actually great for the industry. And that's a win-win-win. Alternatively, there are other players in the market who look at this not about, hey, this is about revenue accretion or this is about product differentiation, but rather they're trying to change the physics of travel distribution. They're trying to gain control over distribution because they're unhappy about their own business model. And in those cases, what you've seen others do is say, there's actually not new product or not new technology capability, but we're going to actually restrict content from the highest yielding channel, which is corporate travel. We're going to impose new costs on the channel to get that which we had yesterday. And we're going to control how you access this, regardless of whether it is equivalent technology and an equivalent platform. And so the consequence of that, when there's discrimination of content or discrimination of economics, and it's done unilaterally by carriers who have, let's say, a strong national presence, is it can mitigate comparison shopping, which is certainly not good for the consumer or good for the client. It will increase cost to the client. And operationally, there's a big step backwards. So think about, for example, not being able to hold seats or make changes to a reservation because it's been booked through NDC as opposed to booked through traditional means. That's a step backwards in terms of functionality and the UX that we offer to the client. A bigger one operationally would be, for example, traditionally for air bookings, we'll use the PNR as the record. And if there are changes made, and in corporate travel, there's changes made typically 3 or 4 times to an individual reservation, we're able to service that and use the PNR as the host to help us service that. And that works very, very well. It's proven. If we go into a world where that booking is made through NDC and it's made in the host of the airline, then there's no PNR created that we have. So the challenge there is, how do you create asynchronous compatibility between that booking which is made in the host, which is typically, Amadeus Altéa, for example, or Sabre, and the PNR that we hold? Because the PNR, remember, may hold interline or other flights, it may hold a hotel booking. There's other things beyond the segment or segments that are booked with the airline where the NDC booking is made. Today, that doesn't exist. And so today, if a booking is made through NDC and changes are made to that, the TMC may not be aware of what those changes are. And we may not be able then to meet the service expectations that the clients have.
So do you see then...
Yeah,
sorry, I was just going to ask you there about restricting content, because you just mentioned it. Do you see that then as an attack on the TMC community, in terms of your future going forward?
No, I don't. I think that as I look at it, what you see, and this is more from certain European carriers that are doing this, and it's a small subset of carriers that are doing this, is they are restricting content, presumably to try to induce the corporate sector to book higher fares. They're pulling out lower fares because they don't want the corporations to book them. It's a reaction to the competition from low-cost carriers and to the hub network of the Middle Eastern carriers, which threaten the very existence of some of these European carriers. And so I don't think it's meant to injure the corporate or TMC marketplace. I think it's more thinking about, how do I compete against these low-cost carriers, and thinking about distribution before thinking about the customer. But in no world, in my eyes, is it rational to take product away from your best customers and to impose additional cost or friction on those customers. And to an extent, you can get away with that domestically because there's limited competition in certain markets. As you go cross-border, you really can't get away with that. And so I think there's experimentation, and I think there's a frustration from certain carriers that the technology is not advanced enough for NDC to happen at scale today. So they're simply taking these measures, I think, because out of frustration. I do think they're temporary, and I think if you go forward 5 or 6 or 7 years, NDC will be in the industry en masse. What we need is for 1 or 2 or 3 or several platforms to basically normalize this content between the suppliers and between the consumers of the content, such as TMCs. The GDSs are well positioned and are well capitalized to be the ones that solve that. But if somebody else comes along and solves that, wonderful. We're not sort of wed to one or the other. It will take a very significant amount of capital. I remember having a conversation with an esteemed former airline CEO about what will it take to solve NDC at scale to where it is systemic for the industry. And I said, I think it'll take $1 billion. And this leader said, I think it will take $2 billion. And so if you look at the capitalization of certain startups in the industry, they may address small pieces of it. But if you can't do, for example, what I talked about, which is synchronize the NDC record with the PNR to make things work in the TMC world, you're going backwards in terms of functionality. So again, I think that over time, the commercial aims and the technology aims will come back together. But I think it's going to be dislocated for the next couple of years as certain carriers take actions out of frustration.
So conscious that time is marching on here. So we've got, four large TMC, what we might call traditional TMC players, and we've got a couple of very well-funded startups. So is there room for everyone in a scenario where we don't really recover for 4 years?
First of all, I'd call us the leading digital TMC in the world.
Okay, well,
we don't think of ourselves
that would be
as a traditional TMC. But yeah, if you look at the market, again, mature B2B market, business travel was, depending on how you measure it, pre-COVID, a $1.4 to $1.7 trillion industry with about a 4 to 5% annual growth rate. So a very healthy, large sector. If you looked at the top 3 TMCs in terms of our turnover, collectively, we had on or about 5 or 6% of that global industry turnover. So it's a very, very fragmented industry. Now, as you go into sort of the Fortune 2000, it's much more concentrated in terms of who handles that business, certainly. But as you go widely, it's much more dispersed. The market is.
That's the question about managed versus unmanaged, isn't it? And do you manage to get more managed because we're in a crisis?
Let me come back to that, and if I forget, okay, tell me. But so the industry was consolidating pre-COVID, and that's natural in a mature B2B industry. People consolidate to get economies of scale, to get cost efficiencies, and in what has become a technology arms race, the need to innovate and spend lots of capital. And this is very similar to what you see in other tech-enabled or tech industries. Being a TMC is now a tech-enabled or tech business, and so there's the need for scale in order to innovate. That was true yesterday. That will be true tomorrow. The market is going to be smaller for the next several years, at least, than it was yesterday. And so we all need to become more efficient. And we're all facing this issue of how do you spend enough capital in a world where the revenue will not be the same as it was yesterday. So the industrial logic for consolidation tomorrow is as stronger than it was yesterday. There's no question about that. I do believe the industry will consolidate. I think right now, you're seeing limited consolidation. You're seeing small tuck-ins because everyone's focused on right sizing and making sure that their business is able to get through the pandemic and is in a position to win when we go forward. So everybody's sort of recalibrating where they are. In terms of again, I call it the business model or the commercial model. Mm-hmm. We have had many clients who understand the situation. And they say, you know what, actually, no, we really want Linda to continue working on our account. We don't want her furloughed, despite the fact that we're not traveling right now. And so whether it's temporary or permanent, we've been able to move from a transaction fee to more of a hybrid pricing structure. Mm-hmm. When you get into a competitive bid situation, which is us going after new business or us protecting what is ours, what happens is, I think you want to walk in with that pricing model and have the discipline, but you're only as good as somebody who comes in and prices hyper aggressively with a transaction fee approach because they say, gee, I have no risk in winning this new business. I don't have to deploy resources until the business comes back. And so again, I think you're going to have the competing factions of a hyper competitive market against, rational decision making by folks like CWT and conversations with our clients. You have to be very careful. I think our clients are very sympathetic. They really honor and appreciate what we do. But by the same token, the travel managers or the chief procurement officers that we deal with, they have their own P&L and they have their own cost structure to worry about. And procurement officers are typically not in the business of paying for services that they're not currently using. So we're trying to find that happy medium. But it's not a one size fits all, and there's not a single panacea for the market.
Okay, a couple of final elements here. Sustainability. I see that you announced initiative around traveler well-being and in the environment. Is there an appetite for that now? Do you sense?
I think
it's just pure survival.
So it's interesting. If you went pre-COVID and you said to a travel manager, "What's the most important part of your program?" They would have said duty of care, the health and welfare of their people.
Right.
And that was their perspective and maybe the chief procurement officers. That's now, this is typically one of the biggest discretionary spend areas a company has. But because of COVID, the CEO, the COO, the CHRO are now keenly interested in travel programs, which again is good in terms of moving this away from being a commodity function versus what it was before. But everybody now is sitting back and saying, I need to relook my travel program. So you're in the most dynamic pricing environment in the history of mankind now. So will traditional approaches to procuring hotel rates, for example, work over the next 2 years? Probably not nearly as effectively as they worked historically. And as you look at that, I think everybody's taking a chance to say, how do I basically make changes to my travel program, worrying not just about, what is the best price, what is the best service, but the health and welfare of our employees, the obligations that we all have around sustainability and the environment, the impact on culture, the changes in workplace. And so I think you're going to see substantive changes and the opportunity for a more balanced approach to travel, where it will not just be, how do we get to the lowest common denominator on price, which is what, largely the focus has been. So I think user experience will become so important. The ability to make sure that you offer proper reporting, proper protocols around health, welfare, and safety. And I think that there is going to be a move, as people can afford it, to become more conscious about the environmental impact of travel. I think what happens is there was a lot of reporting early in COVID about, wow, we've taken a step forward finally in terms of the environmental impact of the travel industry. I think that hits home with a lot of people. And so again, there's a pent up demand to get back on the road, but people want to do it in a responsible fashion. I think inherently we want to do that as individuals, and our clients as companies certainly want to do that as well. So we've gotten a very strong reception. In very simple terms, what we've done is our solutions group, our consulting organization, is working with clients to help them redesign their programs to be more holistic. And that's all we're doing. No different than you would do with any other part of the business.
Okay, very good. So a couple of final points. Do you have a sense for why governments don't seem to be taking or kind of acknowledging the value of corporate travel?
It's a great question. So I'm a big believer that politics rules all for governments, for better or for worse. If you look at the travel industry globally, travel accounts for 15% of global employment and 10% of global GDP. And corporate travel is a significant subset of that. And the impact, by the way, on those is most acute in the developing world. But if you simply looked at it and said, gee, travel as an industry will be down by 50% for a year, which is sort of what we're looking at, that would theoretically reduce global GDP by 5 percentage points, meaning it would put the world into a long-term sustained recession. And so I think there has been a focus by governments on trying to maintain employment and trying to mitigate the GDP impact. But they effectively shut down our industry. And you can argue whether that's good public policy or not, but that was what they decided to do. And there are negative impacts to GDP and negative impacts to employment. Now, I think for the typical government employee or politician, differentiating between leisure and corporate travel is perhaps a bit below the way they think about this. They'll think about, again, what's the economic impact and what's the employment impact on the people that they're elected to serve. And there typically is, at least in democracies, there's probably less sensitivity about what's good for corporations versus what's good for the consumer public. So I think the way governments think about it is leisure travel is probably more sympathetic, even though corporate travel is very pro-growth and very pro-employment. So our focus has not been a focus on corporate travel so much as travel. I'm part of the WTTC. I'm the vice chairman of the U.S. Travel and Tourism Advisory Board. And we have, through those organizations and certain others, we have done our best to make sure governments are aware of the dislocative impact that COVID is having on this industry. And if you look at it, there have been certain government programs that have been in place. I mentioned, for example, PPP in the United States, which has been for smaller agencies than CWT. That's not something we've been able to take advantage of. But those programs, as they begin to run out, are going to, it's not the fault of those programs, but many companies are going to have struggled to survive. And you're going to see the impact on employment be quite severe as we go into the fall and winter. And I think the question is then, will governments step back and say, this is really bad for the long-term consequences of our country? It's a significant portion of our economy. It's very bad for the developing world. And will they take more, bigger rescue measures. So people compare this to 9/11 or the 2008-9 financial crisis. Maybe it's trite, but the best comparison to what we've experienced would be World War II, which is a literal shutdown of the industry. And it's hard, I think, for politicians to think about what measures are needed in that scenario versus, what they know, which is what happened 12 years ago, or what happened 19 years ago.
Yeah.
And, but I think corporate travel, we sort of get lumped into overall travel. And again, you have this argument, what matters more, the economy and jobs or the health and welfare of the people? Well, the answer is yes. And so I think that's something that policymakers all struggle with, and we need to get it right. But again, that's why I think that once there is a widespread vaccine, and I'm hopeful that will come sooner rather than later, I think this begins to take care of itself. The question is the carnage that's taken hold of the market for 2020. Many will not recover from that.
Yeah. Okay, a nice easy one to finish with. What do you think you've learned as a leader from the pandemic?
What have I learned as a leader? One is I work with the most incredible people and the most incredible leadership team I could ever imagine. Again, I've been as honest as I can with people about what the outlook is and what we need to do to weather this. But the spirit and culture of the organization that I'm lucky enough to work for has just floored me. It's humbling, and it makes me very proud that people have reacted as professionally and as proudly as they have to be part of this and want it to succeed going forward. I knew we had a good culture before, but I'm in the debt of every employee that we have today, and the vast majority who are going to be part of this for the long term, and the subset that are not with us. They've been amazing. The other is I guess I grew up in a world, and I was an Army officer for 4 years, but I've been a civilian now for 24. And as a civilian, you deal with sort of static and linear planning. And it's not too hard to figure out what are the right questions to ask, and then to orient around what are the right answers, and then to plan and to execute. And that's hard. But compared to what we've gone through this year, that's actually very easy, because there is so much uncertainty. And, you asked earlier, how do you staff against an uncertain horizon? That's very, very difficult. Imagine trying to staff your store at the mall for Christmas, having no idea whether you're going to see Christmas traffic or July 4th traffic.
Right.
Well, that's effectively what we're facing as an industry every single day. And so, what we do is we get up every day, we deal with the new challenge of the day. We look a lot at the data and try to interpolate and figure out what's coming. But I think you learn that you can't outsmart the market. You simply have to react to what you're seeing, and you have to remain resolute. But again, what have I learned? I've learned that I'm fortunate to work with and for unbelievable people. I knew that before, but I really appreciate that today.
Kurt, thank you. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time. So that's another New Reality interview with. Once again, we'd like to thank our partner, Salesforce, for working with us on these one-to-one interviews. And as the industry looks into the second half of 2020, well, even the final quarter, I might say, we're embark on a new, safe era of travel with Salesforce CRM. And you can find more details of that in the story that accompanies this interview on PhocusWire. Thanks again.
Thank you, Linda.